Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. And they always sound different at those fundraisers, don't they?
Exactly. You know, they're very, very, very sure that nobody's listening. And then you get revelations. And
it seems like the admission that Devin Nunes does on the tapes that, of course, some of Donald Trump's tweets make us cringe is the minimal thing you have to do for credibility, even with a Republican audience, because even they know, although they don't want to say it publicly, that some of these tweets are just nuts.
And it's interesting to, think about the real consequences of that. I mean, on the one hand, that's inarguable. Who on earth doesn't cringe at some of the president's tweets? Presumably every human on the face of the earth. On the other hand, while that seems like a petty thing and an inarguable thing, that's the kind of thing that might really get under the skin of the president when it comes to somebody who has become his most important ally on Capitol Hill.
One of the things they did on that impeachment discussion they had about impeaching Rod Rosenstein is they lied to their contributors with this notion that it is Senate procedure to immediately take up a bill of impeachment from the House of Representatives, and the Senate can do no other business. The House of Representatives sent over the impeachment of a federal judge in 1988 in August. The Senate didn't take up the trial until 14 months later, and even then they did it part-time, a couple of hours a day here and there. It doesn't in any way clog up the Senate on the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. And so my reading of that, Rachel, was them just lying to their enthusiasts who want an impeachment of Rod Rosenstein. It's just the other thing that they do at these fundraisers is they lie and they tell them what they want to hear.
It is striking, though, to see Republican leadership. Cathy McMorris Rodgers, she's in the Republican leadership, right? She's the number 4 Republican. And there's Paul Ryan getting all of this great press and all of this sort of credit for being, the reasonable Republican who's keeping the crazies at bay when that small band of House Republicans say they want to impeach Rod Rosenstein. Paul Ryan comes out and says, no, we're not going to pursue that at all. But then actually at her closed-door fundraiser, Cathy McMorris Rodgers is like, she and Devin Nunes are standing there going, we're not doing it before the election, but afterwards, once we get Kavanaugh in there. I mean, the distance between what they're getting credit for publicly and what they're willing to say, again, to their donors, as you say, behind closed doors, is something that at least requires an explanation. I really thought that we would get a comment from Cathy McMorris Rodgers in her office tonight just because of the stark difference between that public persona and what she's really saying in private, but we've had no response thus far.
It's always amazing what they say in private.
Yeah. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, we'll be talking more about this and about the legal implications of the recordings that Rachel just revealed in this last hour. Rachel didn't get a chance to get into a discussion of those legal implications. Jill Wine-Banks will guide us through that. But today is the 44th anniversary of the most important day in the history of White House corruption. And on this historic anniversary, there is an intense competition in Washington tonight for the title of most corrupt person in government. Because the President of the United States is on that list of possibly the most corrupt person in government once again, as the president was 44 years ago, it is hard for the other people on that list to get the attention that they deserve. And it may be that the non-presidential corruption in Washington will not or cannot come into sharp focus until or unless President Donald Trump says what President Richard Nixon said on this date, 44 years ago, at 9:01 p.m.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
It may be that as long as Donald Trump is a president under investigation for possible conspiracy with Russians to help his presidential campaign, for obstruction of justice while president, and for violating the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution by profiting from his businesses while president, that other Washington corruption stories that would be dominating the news will always be overshadowed by the multiple investigations of President Trump. And today, the first Republican member of Congress to endorse Donald Trump for president, Chris Collins, who also happens to be one of the very richest members of Congress, was arrested and charged with insider trading and lying to federal agents. But even that won't get Chris Collins the full attention he deserves in news coverage tonight because the President of the United States is still being investigated for obstruction of justice while serving as President of the United States, and the President and his lawyers so fear that investigation of obstruction of justice that the President's lawyers have said publicly, and said it once again today, that the President will not answer any questions about obstruction of justice and other issues that the Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller would like to question the President about. Regular viewers of this hour know that I, for one, believe President Trump was never going to submit to any questions by any prosecutor under any circumstances, even back when the President said the chance of him doing that was 100%.
So he said those things under oath. Would you be willing to speak under oath to give your version of those events?
100%.
So if Robert Mueller wanted to speak with you about that,
I would be glad to tell him exactly what I just told you, John.
100%. That was a year ago. And now the chances of the President submitting to an interview with Robert Mueller is almost officially, publicly 0%. Although the President's lawyers continue to play the public game that they are negotiating the terms of an interview with the special prosecutor, a central element of that game has been the Trump lawyers' repeated insistence that President Trump really does want to do the interview with Robert Mueller, and it's just the lawyers who are reluctant. This game is usually played out in Trump team interviews with the New York Times, where the Trump spin is usually accepted as true. Today's report on this game by the New York Times carries the latest version of the Trump team's spin in a paragraph that has appeared repeatedly in the New York Times reporting on this game for the last year. The President's lawyers are concerned that if he is interviewed, Mr. Trump could perjure himself. That concern is in part driving the ongoing negotiations. They had been prepared last week to tell Mr. Mueller that Mr. Trump would decline an interview, but the President, who believes he can convince Mr. Mueller that he is innocent, pushed his lawyers to continue negotiating. Now, whenever you read that paragraph in the New York Times and elsewhere, you might want to rewrite the last line in your head to something like this possible alternative. But the President, who knows he can never convince Mr. Mueller that he is innocent, pushed his lawyers to continue negotiating in order to delay the Mueller investigation so that the President can then publicly complain that the Mueller investigation is still going on. That complaint is, of course, not limited to the President. The President's lawyers who are actually delaying the investigation by proposing restrictions on a presidential interview that they know the special prosecutor cannot accept, are also publicly complaining that the special prosecutor has not yet finished his work. The President's lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, told the New York Times today, "We're restating what we have been saying for months. It is time for the Office of Special Counsel to conclude its inquiry without further delay." That's from one of the men who is causing the delay that he's complaining about there. So now what will Robert Mueller do? Subpoena the President? Today's New York Times report offers some insight into that question. Quote, in a meeting with Mr. Trump's lawyers this year, Mr. Mueller threatened to take the extraordinary step of subpoenaing the President to testify before a grand jury if he did not sit for a voluntary interview. Now, that was reported months ago. But we still do not know if any of that is true, because the sources of the Robert Mueller threat to subpoena the President were the Trump lawyers, not Robert Mueller or anyone on Robert Mueller's staff. And so the Times turned to sources who have worked with Robert Mueller in their report today, worked with Robert Mueller in the past, to try to get a sense of what Robert Mueller might do. Quote, law enforcement officials who have worked with Mr. Mueller, a longtime federal prosecutor and the head of the FBI from 2001 to 2013, believe that he will try to use every tool he has to get the President to answer questions, and that he will probably subpoena him to testify if he does not agree to be questioned voluntarily. Well, okay, that's one possibility. And Trump lawyers offered the New York Times another very credible possibility this time, saying some of Mr. Trump's lawyers believe that Mr. Mueller will not subpoena their client out of fear of losing a court fight that could undermine the investigation's legitimacy to the public. And so Robert Mueller is approaching a very difficult decision point, probably the most difficult decision point that he will face in his investigation of the President of the United States. And now to answer the question of what Robert Mueller will do, what Robert Mueller should do, we are now joined by Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and an MSNBC legal analyst, and Glenn Kirshner, former federal prosecutor. And Jill, thank you for being here on this historic day, 44 years after you heard the president say he was going to resign the next day because your investigation had closed in on President Nixon. What is your reading of where Robert Mueller stands tonight on the issue of what to do with interviewing the president or subpoenaing the president or moving past any possibility of talking to the president and going ahead without that?
First, let me say, Lawrence, that you gave such a good introduction that you've left very little for me to add to it. But and I do remember, by the way, the night of the resignation announcement like it was yesterday. But as to what's
Jill,
going
can we just
on
stop
now,
you on that for a second, because we're not going to
Sure.
be at this day again. Take us back to 9:01 p.m. on that night. All of you in the prosecutor's team, I assume, are sitting around televisions watching the president say those words that he will resign the presidency at 12 noon tomorrow.
I think the first thing that came to our mind was, now can we indict him? He won't be the sitting president anymore. And we had already been turned down by Leon Jaworski while he was the sitting president, despite the fact that we had more than ample evidence of his guilt. And once he wasn't the sitting president, we said, now we could do it. Unfortunately, he was pardoned by his successor, President Ford, before we could return an indictment. And so he never got indicted.
And Jill, so to where Robert Mueller stands tonight, this risk, there is a risk in subpoenaing the president, and that is that the president will challenge the subpoena. And there is possibly the risk that the president could win in his challenge of that subpoena.
I think the chance of his winning that are very, very small. I think that the decision, which was 8-0 in the Nixon case, really says that a president is not above the law. A president had to comply with a subpoena for documents. It is different when it's a subpoena for his own testimony, but I believe that the concept of the opinion says for sure that Mueller would win that argument and the president would lose it. I would say, however, that he may not need his testimony and he may not want his testimony. We are only hearing from the president's lawyers. We don't know what's in Mueller's mind at all. If the president is indeed a target, even if it's only a target of a report rather than an indictment, then maybe he doesn't want to call him in because he would have to take the Fifth Amendment, and that would be something that he might not want to have happen. So it may be that the reason he's not pursuing this is that he doesn't really care. He doesn't need the testimony. The evidence has been in plain sight. I don't think you have to ask him what his intent is. The president has expressed his intent over and over and over again, enough times that we don't have to ask him anymore. He said it to Lester Holt a year ago. Now he has said it again in tweets. So we know what he's thinking. We know why he stopped the or wanted to stop the investigation. He wanted to get rid of the Russia thing. And that's why he fired Comey.
Glenn Kirshner, I know you don't know what Robert Mueller will do, and so I will ask you, if you were on Robert Mueller's team, what would you advise him to do at this point on the issue of speaking to, interviewing the President of the United States?
Well, Lawrence, I think that, all possibilities that the president will actually come in for a voluntary interview have played themselves out. I tend to believe, like you, that the president was never going to voluntarily sit down with Robert Mueller for an interview. His lawyers knew what a danger that would present for him. And so if we move past that, the next question is, should Robert Mueller subpoena the president? And I think, as Ms. Wine-Banks was suggesting, it may very well be that Bob Mueller has now begun to view the president as a target of the investigation. And because the Department of Justice has a policy that they don't allow prosecutors to subpoena targets of the grand jury's investigation because of the right against self-incrimination. Now, there is an exception to that, but it's a rarely used exception. I think that may mean that we never hear from the president, not in a voluntary interview, not under subpoena before a grand jury, and then Bob Mueller moves on to the next phase of his work, and that may be returning indictments. It may be authoring a report that gets released to Congress. It may be a combination of the two. It may be that Bob Mueller decides to return a conspiracy indictment, naming everybody but the president, and just putting everything he's learned about the president's misdeeds into a report to Congress and let Congress handle it as a political issue. And then again, it may be, as I know Ms. Wine-Banks can tell us, that he will choose to name the president as an unindicted co-conspirator in a large conspiracy indictment. I worked for Bob Mueller directly when he was chief of homicide at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, but I will not pretend to be able to look into his head and predict which way he's going. The only thing I can promise everybody is that, you know, he will be governed by the rule of law, and he will announce his findings accordingly.
We're going to listen to something that Rudy Giuliani just said on Fox News tonight, and it's really quite shocking from Rudy Giuliani, a former Justice Department official himself, lying to Fox News viewers about Justice Department policy and saying that this investigation must be over by September, according to Justice Department policy. Let's listen to this.
I think if it isn't over by September, then we have a very, very serious violation of the Justice Department rules that you shouldn't be conducting one of these investigations in the 60-day period.
Glenn Kirshner, your reaction to that?
I was a federal prosecutor for 30 years. I've never heard of such a policy. I think so much of what we've heard from Mr. Giuliani over the past year or so is self-contradictory. He's playing to not a court of law, but a court of public opinion, and he really is just trying to poison the well of the American people in hopes that that may somehow work to the political advantage of the president down the road if this matter gets taken up in impeachment hearings.
I want to show one more thing that Rudy Giuliani said to Sean Hannity tonight, because I think it proves what has been my case, that the negotiations are literally just a game. Sean Hannity asked him, why would you even bother with a counterproposal? Let's watch this.
Why would you even consider a counterproposal?
When it's over with, I'll explain it to you.
Boy, I'm not getting anything out of you tonight. Good to see you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Jill, it certainly sounds like a game to me.
They have been playing this for public relations. They aren't being serious about it. I agree with you that they probably never intended. And probably the most shocking thing that Rudy Giuliani said was that the president could perjure himself if he went in. The president could perjure himself only if he plans to lie and or if he plans to cover up further what he knows he did. So it isn't a perjury trap unless the witness wants to lie about something. And it's shocking that we are at a state of affairs where the President of the United States lawyer is saying that he could commit perjury.
Yeah, the president's lawyer's public negotiating position is the president is so guilty of something that he will lie about it and commit perjury if he is interviewed by the Mueller team. That's their public position. We're going to have to take a break here. Glenn Kirshner, thank you for helping us start this off tonight. And Jill Wine-Banks is going to be with us when we come back, because we're going to get Jill's legal reaction to those secret audio recordings of Devin Nunes speaking at a Republican fundraiser. These recordings were exclusively obtained by the Rachel Maddow Show. Rachel played these recordings in the last hour, but Rachel didn't get a chance to do any kind of legal analysis of these recordings yet in her hour. We will do that next. As Rachel reported in the last hour, we now have tapes of Republican Congressman Devin Nunes telling us what he really thinks, or at least telling Republican contributors what he thinks they really want to hear. One thing Devin Nunes felt he had to say to the Republican contributors gathered in Washington state to support the candidacy of Republican Catherine McMorris Rodgers was that, quote, sometimes you love the president's tweets, sometimes we cringe on the president's tweets. That is something that every Trump supporter I've ever spoken to in private admits to, cringing at some of the president's tweets. Devin Nunes did admit that it is criminal to collude with a foreign country or foreign nationals in an American campaign, but he seemed to identify a very narrow definition of criminal conduct.
Now, if somebody thinks that my campaign or Kathy's campaign is colluding with the Chinese, or you name the country, it couldn't happen. It would be a very bad thing if Kathy was getting secrets from the Portuguese, let's say, just because I'm Portuguese by background. So Kathy was getting secret information from the Portuguese. May or may not be illegal, but ultimately, if let's say the Portuguese came and brought her some stolen email, and she decided to release those, okay, now we have a crime, right? Because somebody stole the emails, gave to Kathy released them. Well, if that's the case, then that's criminal.
Because somebody stole the emails, gave them to Kathy, Kathy released them. Well, if that's the case, then that's criminal. No one is saying that that's the case with the Trump campaign. What if someone stole the emails, did not give them to Kathy, but gave them to someone else to release them to benefit Kathy? Devin Nunes and Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers lied to their contributors, just lied to them when they said that the reason they were not moving forward quickly with the impeachment of Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein in the House of Representatives is that the Senate would then have to immediately take up that impeachment trial after the House voted to impeach Rod Rosenstein. And the Senate trial of Rod Rosenstein would then prevent the Senate from confirming the president's choice for the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh. That is an outright, absolute lie. The Senate would be under no timing obligation to take up a bill of impeachment sent over to the Senate for trial. The House of Representatives will never vote on impeaching Rod Rosenstein, and the Senate will never have an impeachment trial of Rod Rosenstein. But at Republican fundraisers, Republicans like Devin Nunes and Kathy McMorris Rodgers will probably continue to lie to their contributors who are hoping for an impeachment of Rod Rosenstein. Joining our discussion now, Jennifer Rubin, a conservative opinion writer for the Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor, and Jill Wine-Banks is back with us. And Jill, I wanted to get your legal reading of the way Devin Nunes described what he considered criminal collusion. If foreign power were to steal some emails and give them directly to a campaign, and the campaign were then to directly publicize those emails for the campaign's benefit, that would be collusion. That seems like a very narrow definition.
It is a narrow definition, and I also want to say we aren't using the word collusion anymore. I've started a hashtag, say this, not that, and we're going to be calling it criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States or criminal conspiracy to violate the election laws, because that's what it is. It's a much broader legal problem for the Republicans than Devin Nunes described. What he said is true. That is criminal. It would be criminal. But it's also criminal if you accept anything of value from a foreign individual or a foreign government, especially when it happens to be an enemy of our country, not a friend or ally. But you cannot accept anything, even from our closest allies, if it is a foreign person. So once you have, his description was of a Portuguese giving something to the candidate. It doesn't matter what country it is, you can't take it. Anything of value is barred by our election laws. And so there's a much broader thing, and it doesn't matter whether you publish it or you knowingly allow someone to publish it, or whether you just send an email that says, I love it, especially later in the summer, and then WikiLeaks publishes it later in the summer.
Jennifer Rubin, the notion that the Senate has to immediately take up bill of impeachment. The last time we saw an impeachment at this level was of a federal judge. 1988 in August, the House voted to impeach a federal judge. The Senate did not begin the trial until 14 months later in 1989, and then they did it part-time, a couple of hours here, a couple of hours there. Senate business was never interrupted by that impeachment.
It's like all these Republicans went to the same bad law school, and they never picked up the Constitution, and they know nothing about their jobs, because what they say is essentially nonsense. Jill is right. First of all, that's entirely wrong. Secondly, as Jill was saying, this criminal conspiracy is a broader issue, and what is illegal is to also solicit something of value, which is arguably what Donald Trump Jr. was doing when he said, "I love it." So really, all of their legal beeswax is nonsense. I will say this. I think it's a big political embarrassment once again for Paul Ryan, who has left an unserious, irresponsible person in Devin Nunes in a very important job as head of the House Intelligence Committee. And now we have Cathy McMorris Rodgers, who is the number 4 person, doing very badly, by the way, in her primary, who is sitting there like a lump in the log as this guy goes on waxing about how his primary job is to protect the president, not to do his job. These people look like stooges. They look like they have indulged a character like Devin Nunes, and they haven't done their job. And if there's ever a better reason to get rid of Paul Ryan's party, it's this. They exercise no responsibility. It's always about the party, always about protecting the president, never about doing their constitutional obligation. So my takeaway from this is primarily political, that these people really are irredeemable. And if you want an effective constitutional check on the president of the United States, you're going to have to change parties.
Well, that is exactly what they seem to be worried. I want to play one more part of this where Devin Nunes says we're the only ones. It sounds to me like he's saying you've got to elect Republicans or we're going to have an impeachment of the president. Let's listen to this.
So therein lies, so it's like your classic catch-22 situation where, I mean, we're at this what puts us in such a tough spot. If Sessions won't unrecuse and Mueller won't clear the president, we're the only ones, which is really the danger. That's why I keep, and thank you for saying it, by the way. I mean, we have to keep all these things. We have to keep the majority. If we do not keep the majority, all of this goes away.
Jill, that sounded to me like if we don't keep the majority, the president gets impeached.
Well, it sounds to me like if we don't keep the majority, the truth will come out and we will know what's happening. And that's what he's worried about and what I think Americans should want to happen. We want to know the truth and we see the truth. It's right in front of our eyes. So when are Republicans going to realize that when they give speeches in fundraisers, they're being recorded and they're making mistakes?
I think tonight. Right. I think tonight is when they're going to realize that. We're going to have to take a break in here. Jennifer Rubin, Jill Wine-Banks, I think the Republicans might just figure that out. When we come back, we will be coming back to the Trump swamp. President's first congressional supporter gets arrested today, and his Secretary of Commerce is accused by a business magazine of being one of the greatest grifters in American history. When Donald Trump's campaign handlers told him to say he would drain the swamp in Washington, he didn't understand what drain the swamp meant. He had never heard that phrase before. He didn't want to use it. But then he read it on the teleprompter at one of his rallies, and the crowd went wild because they understood what it meant: clean up all the dirty, lobbyist-driven and money-driven corruption in Washington. And the way Donald Trump promised to do that was to put a rich guy in charge in the White House who could not be bribed, and then he would hire other rich guys who could not be bribed.
I love all people, rich or poor, but in those particular positions, I just don't want a poor person. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
And so Donald Trump hired the richest Secretary of Commerce in history, who Forbes magazine is now calling among the biggest grifters in American history. And today, the first Republican member of Congress to endorse Donald Trump for president, Chris Collins, was arrested and charged with insider trading and lying to the FBI. He pleaded not guilty today in federal court in Manhattan. Prosecutors allege that Congressman Collins shared inside information with his son about a biotech company in which they were both heavily invested. Congressman Collins' son and his son's wife and family members immediately sold off their stock, avoiding $750,000 in losses when the stock lost 90% of its value as soon as the inside information, which was bad news for the company, became public information a few days later. Prosecutors say that Congressman Collins actually made phone calls to his son to pass along the inside information while he was at a White House congressional picnic last year. There's video of him at that picnic with the phone to his ear, making those phone calls. Democratic Senator Ron Wyden said the Collins indictment represents everything Trump and his Republican allies in Congress have stood for since taking office. Insiders getting special deals while working Americans are left in the dust. A new report in Forbes magazine says that Forbes has uncovered a pattern about the Trump Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. Over several months, in speaking with 21 people who know Ross, Forbes uncovered a pattern. Many of those who worked directly with him claim that Ross wrongly siphoned or outright stole a few million here and a few million there, huge amounts for most, but not necessarily for the Commerce Secretary, at least if you consider them individually. But all told, these allegations, which sparked lawsuits, reimbursements, and SEC fine, come to more than $120 million. Dan Alexander, the author of that report in Forbes magazine about Wilbur Ross, joins us next, along with Trump biographer Tim O'Brien. Congressman Chris Collins, who was charged with insider trading and lying to federal agents today, refused to take questions tonight when he made a brief statement to the press.
I believe I acted properly and within the law at all times with regard to my affiliation with Innate. Throughout my tenure in Congress, I have followed all rules and all ethical guidelines when it comes to my personal investments, including those with Innate.
Joining our discussion now, Dan Alexander, reporter for Forbes magazine, and Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. Tim is an MSNBC contributor. And Dan Alexander, I want to start with you and your extraordinary reporting on Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. And I have to say, being familiar with Wilbur Ross's business and his business history, I have been waiting since he was nominated to be the Secretary of Commerce for the dam to break on the multiple, very swampy involvements and business history of Wilbur Ross. And you seem to have done it with these interviews and the pattern of business he engaged in before becoming secretary and what he's done since becoming secretary.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of rich guys who get sued for various things, but not like this, not by so many former partners, by so many investors, to have such consistent allegations and to have it all add up to such a significant amount of money. I mean, $123 million is a huge sum for anyone, including Wilbur Ross.
And Dan, just take us through what he was supposed to do in terms of what he said he would do with his finances when becoming Commerce Secretary and what he actually didn't do.
Sure. So like all public officials, Wilbur Ross made agreements before he took office that he would divest the majority of his holdings. And in November of last year, he certified that he, in fact, had done that on a sworn statement, when, in fact, he had not done that. And instead, he still owned more than $10 million of stock in the parent company of his former private equity fund, a company called Invesco, that he didn't sell until about a month and a half after that. And he still held stock in an air leasing company that he held on to for more than a year after he was supposed to. And he had shorted a company that he said that he thought that he had an interest in, so he was taking a short to cancel out that interest. But in fact, he didn't have an interest in it, so the short wasn't necessary. All of this stuff, he said, was a result of simple mistakes, but it's hard to believe that one of the most sophisticated investors in the country would make so many large mistakes at so many different companies.
Tim O'Brien, how could this have gone wrong for Donald Trump? He told his audience, you don't want poor people doing this kind of work. You want rich guys doing this kind of work. You want rich guys in Congress who can't be corrupted like Chris Collins. You want rich guys in the cabinet like Wilbur Ross.
Right, Lawrence. And so what we've learned is that Trump did not drain the swamp. He just filled it with bigger alligators. And you know, Dan's great reporting, which I admire so much, has really exposed just around the fact pattern everything that's untoward about Wilbur Ross's holdings while he's serving as the Commerce Secretary. And there's been a lot of really great reporting in addition to Dan's around this. And the list is almost so long it would be impossible to get through it in this program. In addition to the stuff that Dan has already pointed out, Ross was negotiating trade agreements with China during a time when he owned a company that was exporting natural gas to China. He had a shipping company that was doing business in China and was partially owned by the Chinese government while he's overseeing trade policy with China. He has another company that's exporting steel from South Korea at the same time that the Trump administration is imposing steel tariffs on some of our competitors, but giving South Korea an exemption. All of this stuff it just smells, and it's amazing that it's taken this long for it to come to a head.
Dan, how long have you been working on the Wilbur Ross story?
Well, there have been many Wilbur Ross stories, but I first started covering him about a year ago when we were looking to see how much money he was worth, and that was when we uncovered that although he had been claiming to us for years that he had billions of dollars, he in fact did not. And once you figured that out, then sort of all of this other stuff started unraveling. And as one investor told me, he said, once you figure out that the guy is essentially, for lack of a better word, a fraud, you figure out that anything that he says really isn't quite correct.
Tim O'Brien, quickly take us inside the head of Donald Trump tonight. He's watching Chris Collins charged with these crimes along with his son. Does he see the possible mirror of Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr.? Because Chris Collins' son might be faced with the choice of, do I testify against my father in order to stay out of prison?
That's such a great observation, Lawrence. I have to believe that some of that resonates with Trump. A lot of his behavior lately, I think, lashing out on Twitter, lashing out against law enforcement officials, is because he can't control an investigation in its entirety that's also starting to target his son and may eventually ensnare his son-in-law and his daughter. So he must be seeing this with Collins and wondering about all of those things. The other interesting thing in all of this is Wilbur Ross's behavior is very similar to Trump's. Inflating their wealth, treating business partners poorly. I think Trump probably looks in the mirror and sees Wilbur Ross.
Yeah. Tim O'Brien, thank you for joining us. And Dan Alexander, thanks for your great reporting. Thanks for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. When we come back, Michael Cohen is in much worse trouble than we already thought Michael Cohen was in. Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's former personal lawyer, is now in even more legal trouble than we thought. He is in so much legal trouble now that his TV lawyer, Lanny Davis, actually said no comment when asked about new reports that Michael Cohen could be facing a 5-year sentence in federal prison, 5 years or more even. 2018 is the year of the TV lawyer, by which I mean not real trial lawyers like Michael Avenatti, who make many, many appearances on TV talking about the cases that they actually handle in court. I mean the TV lawyers who only go on TV to talk about the cases and never actually do any real legal work for their clients. Donald Trump's TV lawyer is, of course, Rudy Giuliani, whose only task is defending Donald Trump on TV. If President Trump goes into court to fight a subpoena issued by Robert Mueller, it won't be Rudy Giuliani arguing the case. It will be a real lawyer who knows how to handle real courtroom situations, which Rudy Giuliani has not done in decades. Same thing with Lanny Davis, who is Michael Cohen's TV lawyer, whose job is simply to go on TV and try to defend Michael Cohen and speak to reporters on and off the record trying to defend Michael Cohen. If Michael Cohen finds himself charged with federal crimes, it won't be Lanny Davis standing beside him in real legal proceedings in a real courtroom. That will be Guy Petrillo, a real criminal defense lawyer who Michael Cohen hired months ago. So when Lanny Davis, the lawyer Michael Cohen hired just to talk to the press, says no comment, that's Lanny Davis's way of saying, wow, this case just got a lot worse for us. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that federal prosecutors in New York City are investigating Michael Cohen for possible tax fraud. Sources told the Wall Street Journal that Michael Cohen received hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash from his taxi business in New York, cash that was paid to him by another taxi operator, Evgeny Friedman. The very bad news for Michael Cohen is that Mr. Friedman has already pleaded guilty to criminal tax fraud in a case brought by the New York State Attorney General. Mr. Friedman is reportedly cooperating with investigators. And for big-time or even small-time tax evaders out there, it is very bad news when you find out that your accountant has been subpoenaed to testify to a grand jury by federal prosecutors. The Wall Street Journal reported yesterday that Michael Cohen's accountant, Jeffrey Getzel, has been subpoenaed by federal prosecutors. A report by CNN.com says that Michael Cohen's accountant, Jeffrey Getzel, was actually subpoenaed by federal prosecutors before the raid by the FBI on Michael Cohen's office, hotel room, and home in April. These reports also indicated that Michael Cohen is being investigated for bank fraud, including lying about his assets when applying for loans. Now, the penalties for tax evasion and bank fraud are much, much more severe than possible penalties for violation of campaign finance law that investigators were already considering in relation to Michael Cohen's arrangements to pay women for their silence about their relationships with Donald Trump during the presidential campaign. We will be right back with a last word on the troubles Michael Cohen has now. Convictions of violating election law rarely result in jail terms, but when they do, the prison time is usually measured in months. The maximum sentence for tax fraud is 5 years. The maximum sentence for bank fraud is 30 years. And now we discover Michael Cohen is being investigated for all of those things. Back with us is Jennifer Rubin. And Jennifer, these new revelations about the possible 5-year sentences and 30-year sentences for possibly multiple counts that Michael Cohen could be facing really changes the dynamics of what he's facing.
Yeah, it does. And might I say, I don't think I've ever seen an administration with this few people who are not in some kind of legal trouble. Really, if you're not being indicted or haven't been indicted or aren't considering a plea deal, you're really the odd man out. But Michael Cohen, we knew, was in some trouble. Now we know he's in a heap of trouble. What's significant, he's also in trouble from state authorities. And as we know, he cannot be pardoned by the President of the United States for state crimes. So I think the time that he is going to have to start cooperating feverishly with the prosecutors is coming closer and closer.
And of course, Michael Cohen knew what we've been learning about the investigation. He knew that long before we did. And so we now have to look back at his behavior with the knowledge that he had, that he was being investigated for bank fraud and for tax fraud.
Correct. And the fact that he was apparently shut out of the president's inner circle, feeling abused and left alone to sort of flounder on his own. It also puts in context that raid on his office, his home, and his hotel. The president was carrying on about how this was unprecedented. There was no reason for it. My gosh, given all the possible avenues of conviction here, you could sure understand why they were looking for evidence anywhere they could find it.
They had an awful lot of reasons for it. Jennifer Rubin gets tonight's last word. Thank you, Jennifer.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes from MSNBC. You know, every day I come to the office and we make a television show. And every day I think to myself, there's so much more I want to talk about. And so this is our podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening? And the whole idea behind it is to get to the root of the things that we see play out every day. They're driven by big ideas. Each week, I sit down with a person uniquely suited to explain why this is happening.
New episodes of Why Is This Happening? Every Tuesday. Listen for free wherever you get your podcasts.